Hello, everybody. This is the ICHK May 2022 essay title discussion for theory of knowledge. And we're joined today by Alex Hall, Flora, Isabel Khine, Flora Isabel Khine, and Kunal Narwani. Thank you very much for joining us. Could you please just introduce yourselves and which areas of knowledge you'll be representing predominantly today, please?
Hi, yes, I'm Alex Hall. I'm going to be representing historical knowledge that at ICHK and also a little bit of human sciences as well.
Very good.
Hi.
Miss Lai, Flora.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Flora and I will be representing primarily the natural sciences today.
And is Isabel Khine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel Khine. I'm going to be talking about the arts mostly.
Great. And I'm just putting up there, these are the three questions. And then Mr. Narwani, Kunal, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello again. Well, you do know my name now. I'm representing, well, at least doing my best to represent mathematics.
And your microphone's a little bit muffly or buffeting around, so I don't know if you're able to, if it's possible to just move a bit further back, but we hear you loud and clear. So we're going to look at these three questions today. Number two is, to what extent would you agree that the claim that there's a world of difference between truth and facts, always referring to two areas of knowledge? That's a quote by Maya Angelou, the civil rights campaigner and or Black American author. Number three, is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly than knowledge in another area of knowledge? Discuss with reference to the natural sciences and one other area of knowledge. Number six, if we conclude that there is some knowledge that we should not pursue on ethical grounds, how can we determine the boundaries of acceptable investigation within an area of knowledge? I'm a theory of knowledge and arts-based teacher because I teach language and literature. But our psychology teacher, thank you very much, Miss Sammy Chan, she's prepared these notes. So I will also adopt a psychology head during today's talk. So I think we should do it like, makes sense to just do it one by one, I think. So let's take number two. To what extent would you agree with the claim that there's a world of difference between truth and facts? Miss Khine, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah, sure, why not? So I'm actually a big fan of Maya Angelou. As an English teacher, I read a lot of her work in the past. And I came across an article on the Literary Hub where she talks about how food is healing. And basically in this article, she discusses how different forms of communication are valued differently depending on whether or not a society or group of people has social capital and social power. And it got me thinking about how, well, if fact in, I don't know, the sciences, I'm not that strong in the sciences, so correct me if I'm wrong, scientists, but if fact in the sciences is rooted in statistics and it's rooted in numbers and figures, then truth is going to be the human experience of those numbers and experiences. So Maya Angelou, in the article, she writes, writing and cookery are just two different means of communication. Indeed, I feel cooking is a natural extension to my autobiography. So for her, food isn't just food, it's another form of storytelling, a way to bring people together or devices for the growth of the soul. And I think what she's communicating here is that, you know, the Western intellectual tradition that we tend to work within, and to be honest, in theory of knowledge, we even continue to work within, doesn't value our ways of seeing, thinking, or the ways of seeing, thinking, and understanding that marginalized communities value, right? So we're sort of inclined to develop our own, and that becomes our truth, even if that truth is not valued in kind of stereotypical or normalized educational spaces. So yeah, for me, I think then truth is about our experience of an objective thing and turning it into our own kind of lived experience. Yeah.
That's a great opening start. Thank you. So I really like that quote that writing is about and art is about devices for the growth of the soul. And then you contrasted that with the Western intellectual tradition, which I think is founded really on the Enlightenment age of science and reason. So maybe it makes sense to go to Flora next. What would a scientist make of that claim by Maya Angelou?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, out of the three questions, that was the one that actually sort of jumped at me when I looked and tried to digest these questions. Because those two key words in that question, truth and facts, to a scientist, I think can mean quite different things. And I think Ms. Khine hit the nail on the head there when she said, as scientists, when you're dealing with facts, we tend to think of the data in sciences. So what kind of numbers are you collecting in an experiment? What kind of statistical analysis can you do on that data? What kind of observations are you making in your experimentation, or indeed in whatever scientific studies that you're doing? And then I think what scientists then tend to do is try and give reasoning behind those observations, okay? And that can be done through, setting a research question and then going about investigating that research question further, gathering more facts, gathering more data. And then at a certain stage, perhaps theories can come about. So with reasoning, with the facts gathered, scientists can then propose theories that connects the facts and the reasoning together. And so far I haven't mentioned the word truth, because to a scientist, and I am more of a, if we are going to put a sort of a label with my interest in sciences, and that is I'm more of a biological science person. And so to me, when I work with my students in the IB sciences, or in whatever level of science, when we do an experiment, when we look at data and so on, I always try and say to students, avoid using the word prove. So I know as a mathematician, for example, Mr. Narwani, that word often comes up. Correct me if I'm wrong. That you're proving something, you're proving that this equals that. In science, however, I tend to steer my students away from that word. And that's because, yes, we can gather facts, we can gather evidence, and we can theorize, but we are often reluctant to say that something is the absolute truth. There are scientists who say that we believe that this is true, but it's not to say that it's going to be true forever, if people see what I mean. So, the classic example there would be the atomic model. We thought that those subatomic particles of protons, neutrons, and electrons were the smallest we could get to, and then that was the truth, and that's what an atom is made of. But then the physicists in the room there could tell me that actually, it's like, no, these protons and neutrons are made of smaller things called quarks. But that didn't come at the same time as the Rutherford's experiment, for example. Okay, that came much later with improvement in technology and so on. So I think there is a lot to be said from the natural sciences point of view for that question. Merely just comparing what those two words actually mean is very interesting.
Right, that's excellent. Thank you. Before I introduce Mr. Hall's perspective from either history or psychology, I think it's worthwhile looking at actually the language within the question itself. So that quotation, there's a world of difference between truth and facts, actually is taken from a longer, wider quotation from Maya Angelou. Now, I haven't been able to find where this exactly does come from. I've been able to find the next section. She says, there's a world of difference between truth and facts. Facts obscure truth. So that word obscure is to like in an eclipse, the moon or something gets in front of it and obscures the sun. So it doesn't actually negate it. She's not saying that. It doesn't falsify it, but it obscures it. There's a kind of muddying of the water. So I think the idea of taking a quote within the looking further at the context of the wider quote, that's very important with language and literature, because the meaning of a text changes according to context, purpose, and time. Mr. Hall, as a historian, what do you think about this idea of truth and facts? Because you would take a scientific approach as much as you could, right? But
yes.
History, you can't perform live experiments because we're going back in time. Can you talk to us about history?
Yeah, so history has, or tries to use at least some of the trappings of the sciences or the human sciences, where we try and come up with a hypothesis, we identify evidence to support or contradict a hypothesis, and then we reframe our hypothesis and come up with a conclusion, which is then peer reviewed by other experts in the fields that we might be writing in. So with the idea of the world of difference between truth and facts, I think I look at this as being the idea that a set of facts, so a written document, a find on an archaeological site, a piece of landscape, like a building or something like that, a diary entry, a photograph, those might be facts of an event. An event happened at this time in this place, but truth is something more that incorporates the interpretation of the person that's writing. So the example I often use in my class when we're talking about the accounts of an eyewitness, for example, now they might faithfully, as far as possible, recount their experience of the storming of the Normandy beaches, for example. And we take that to be the facts of what happened, and then we use that to construct around that the truth of the invasion of Normandy, the Normandy landings. However, what we're doing is we're creating or interpreting or saying that this is true, or this is a truth for everybody's or for the experiences of everybody at that time, which, if we look at other facts, other bits of information about those landings, we might find, well, actually, that was a truth as far as that soldier's experience on that particular beach is concerned. But actually, if you're 50 kilometers down the beach, your experience is very, very different. So it's true that there is an event called the Normandy landings. There was an event that Britain declared war on Germany in 1939. There are these facts, but truth is based out of or comes from an interpretation of those facts. And our facts are never perfect, which means that the amount of truth about the experience of that event can be different. But we've got to be careful that we don't say, well, that means that all interpretations are equally valid. Some obviously, which would, I mean, a classic example, I suppose, would be Holocaust denialism. There is, that is someone's truth, I suppose, but isn't a valid truth because it doesn't look at the facts or a range of facts. It ignores some of them in a lot of cases, or in most cases, actually, of all Holocaust denialism. So there is a world of difference between truth, but some truth is more valid than others, I suppose.
Right. I'd really like to hear from Mr. Narwani on this, because I think the history aspect of taking artifacts, objects, documentary evidence, photographs, and you're building a hypothesis to the best possible extent that you can. And when you look at a really good history book, something that's won the Pulitzer Prize or whatever the gold standard of a history book is, that you'll often find the sources goes to like 100-200 pages. It's exhaustively well researched, but that human experience is something which means that it's more of an interpretation rather than the pure, simple, clean reasoning that can occur when you're looking at a mathematical solution. But before I do that, because you're talking about Holocaust denialism, Miss Chan's notes here are talking about this study by Wagner and Groeneweg. Now, there are all of these statistical records that the Nazis created. So there's irrefutable proof about the Holocaust, and you can see the old Auschwitz and other death camps, and like the physical structures are still there. There's photographs, there's films of this, there's eyewitness testimony. So, but this study looks at the idea of how compelling is this eyewitness testimony because of the nature of memory and the nature of trauma and time and how fractured and how language is unable to recall accurately, because we're human. The same person walks into the room 20 minutes later, like they're going to like read or interpret or act in a different way. See, it's like one individual person is unpredictable, let alone a whole society. So the evidence used, eyewitness testimony, is often used as a gold standard in the courts of law. But we've seen with our study of 12 Angry Men and the work by Elizabeth Loftus, how fallible eyewitness testimony can be. But there is a scientific underpinning to the way in which a historian would try to go about their research. Now hearing all of that, can I just ask Mr. Narwani?
Yeah, sure.
What are you thinking as a mathematician? Does this sound strange? Strange or understandable, or you as a mathematician, you're like, wow, in these different areas there's a lot of ambiguity, which is not the case in my subject.
Thank you for that. I do agree, actually. I think for mathematics overall, it's quite straightforward, and a lot of the questioning that we do as humans, I think in general, comes from a lot of truths and facts. And in mathematics, I would say they're quite interchangeable. I haven't come across many experiences where there has been a situation where I cannot use the word truth for the word fact. I guess an example would be Euclid. In his time, he created a lot of geometric facts, which helped develop a lot of geometric understanding of the things we use today, for example, shapes and things of that nature. But once again, if we were to, we can try and challenge these facts. We can always do that. I mean, it's a part of discovering and exploring mathematics altogether. But then often I think almost always you'll find that you cannot disprove what's already been proven. So just like what Euclid has found. I think with all of our discussions, we realize that, in arts, in history, there's a lot of interpretation, but there has to be, or at least in my opinion, there has to be some level of foundation, some level of agreement where things don't change. And I think that's where mathematics comes in. I think that helps create some level of stability. And then on top of that, if we can interpret our understanding. So how do we, as humans, understand the numbers, and how do we make that our personal truth? Is where the deviation comes in, at least in my opinion. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Now I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, please. And I think we should move on to the next question, which is number 3. Can you see that on your Zoom screens? No.
No.
Then I will share screen. There it is. Is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly than knowledge in another area of knowledge? With physics, understanding things about Euclidean geometry, then Newtonian principles of gravity and the laws of our world and our universe. Moving on to Einstein, who used mathematics in his theory of relativity to understand the influence of black holes and the warping of time and space. Mathematics seems fundamental to natural science knowledge production. But I just wanted to say to Mr. Narwani, there's an example in our cognitive textbook, because I think if you're writing a TOK essay, it's good to deal with the claims. It's also good to find the counterclaims. Now, Bertrand Russell, a towering philosopher from the 20th century, like Plato, Plato believed the entry to his academia, or whatever it was called, you needed to know geometry to enter, because he wanted people who were able to do pure reasoning, clear, clean syllogisms to try to get to the absolute truth. Bertrand Russell was also a mathematician and a philosopher, but he said, hang on, we've been assuming that all of these laws have been proved substantially across millennia, but that they maybe haven't. Now, as an English teacher, I can't tell you the examples that he uses, but the textbook says that he spends 2 volumes trying to work out whether 2 + 2 actually equals 4, because there are so many assumptions we make within what those values actually mean. That's all confusing stuff to me. Do you have any sense of where facts may not be facts in maths, Mr. Narwani?
I think, and this might go against whatever we've established with mathematics. I think an example would be how Einstein, if we go back more in time, at first we thought the Earth was flat, and then we understood through sciences and mathematics, we understood that the Earth is actually not flat, it's round. so we are challenging facts that were established beforehand. But then I do think, however, there are certain facts that we cannot disprove, and those are the most fundamental ones. And those are the ones that we need to adhere to if we were to, for example, study deeper into natural sciences. It is a part of exploration as well. I do think math is ever growing, because there's argument now as well. Is math invented, or is math discovered? I still do believe math is more discovered than invented, but then we need to constantly ask questions as well. At the same time, understand that we have established a lot of facts, and we have established a lot of fundamentals that help us explore deeper and explore further areas in our day-to-day. Because again, we're exploring, we're coming across new things, I think, almost every year. I mean, you see development of technology just exploding year after year, and mathematics is a part of that growth as well. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Well, thank you. Right. So for this question, is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly? Perhaps a mathematician would say, well, I've heard Miss Lai talk about avoiding the word proof, because we can say we're reluctant to avoid ideas of absolute truth in the natural sciences, because there can be these paradigm shifts where we're working either with like atomic modeling, but whether the Earth is flat or whether the Earth is round, or I've often used Galen's belief handed down within the medical community that where there's 4 humors, there's black bile, but the black bile doesn't even exist, but it's been handed down through the doctor's training manuals for 1,500 years. Now, maybe I can ask Miss Lai to say, maybe can you make the case that natural science knowledge is more solid, it can be more solidly justified, and then maybe we could try to tackle that from an artistic and a historical perspective.
I actually have a maybe somewhat controversial view on this, in that, as a scientist myself, I don't think that this question, so where it says, is there a solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly than knowledge in other areas of knowledge? I actually think there is not. This is why, because I think that yes, we should be regarding knowledge in the natural sciences highly, but my I guess issue with this question is the word more. I think we, in different areas of knowledge, look at knowledge and justification for that knowledge through different lenses, but I can't say that we should say that knowledge in natural sciences should be regarded more highly. Is my take on this question, because part of this is because I think that we as humans have given these areas of knowledge these boundaries, and to me they are quite artificial boundaries that we have set for these different areas of knowledge, for good reasons. The sciences, we have the scientific method, for example, because that's a logical way of moving things forward in the sciences, for example. But what I'm saying is that one can argue that all of these different areas of knowledge interconnect. And you can't really talk about the natural sciences, for example, without talking about the arts. You can't really be talking about natural sciences without mathematics. I actually, and from a personal experience, the course that I actually studied at university isn't called biology, or isn't called genetics or biochemistry. It's actually called natural sciences. And from what I read about the course structure and so on, I think the history behind my university calling it that, despite us being able to further along the way specialize in our different areas of sciences, is exactly what I've been talking about, is this idea that actually, even within the sciences, we've given these different areas quite an artificial divide. So the physics, the chemistry, and the biology, and so on. But in truth, they are just the sciences, and they all interrelate to one another. I'm often finding myself teaching biology IB in the biology classroom, and then talking about chemistry, or indeed sometimes physics. So I think if we sort of move that even to a wider view, natural sciences always relate to the arts and the history or the mathematics. And I don't think that it should ever really be more highly regarded. It should be highly regarded knowledge, but it shouldn't be at any point be more highly regarded knowledge.
Right. Does anyone want to jump in there or wonder what an artist, a writer might think about that? Isabel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with, oh, sorry, Mr. Hall.
No, that's
yeah,
right.
I agree with Miss Lai. My answer is no, there is no solid justification for regarding knowledge in natural sciences more highly. And I think as well, you know, you can turn, I think the interesting thing about TOK is that you can turn the logic of TOK back onto itself, right? So, you know, Mr. Rees mentioned, you know, our Platos, our Russells, our Locks, our Humes, and yes, these are the foundations of a Western philosophical tradition. But the issue with that is that as soon as we start to categorize things in that way, we start to make comparisons, right? If you think about, you know, as year 13s, I know I can't see you, so this feels kind of weird, but as year 13s, you're embarking on your higher education journeys, think about how you value subject areas, right? And is that something, do you naturally tend to value other subject areas over others? Why do you choose to study a specific subject at university versus something else? And there's this really great decolonial educational theorist called Bell Hooks, and she writes in her book, Teaching to Transgress, about this idea that education is a practice of freedom. And I think that really relates to what Miss Lai has just said, and I think really supports what Miss Lai has just said, because by categorizing and making those like false dichotomies where we're limiting the way that we can understand the world and see the world, right? Yeah, I think it's something that is not just contained within this question, but really goes beyond this room that you're in, right? Like, this is a question that you should be grappling with in your day-to-day lives. Because if you think about, you know, the nature of truth and how truth is passed down, you know, if we focus on Plato, if we focus on Russell, there's nothing wrong with that. But what we're still doing is really valuing what we've written down, right? And a massive area of interest for me, at least, is oral history. So how indigenous cultures, especially in North America and on the African continent, have used oral history and stories to pass down truth and knowledge, right? And we value that less because we place so much emphasis on the written word. And we do that in your exams. We do that, you know, by virtue of having a TOK essay where we are valuing the written word, right? And I think it's really interesting to kind of look at that from a different perspective of, well, if, you know, I could not write, you know, if writing was not an option, if writing hadn't been invented for whatever reason, how would I choose to communicate, and what kind of knowledge would we value? Because in indigenous cultures across North America, they have the same structures of stories that we're used to, perhaps, or what we've taught you in English literature. And they even have citations and footnoting in their oral tradition, where they refer to their forefathers who passed these stories on to them, right? So it's not that these knowledge systems are necessarily unique to us. It's just that we tend to lean towards valuing them because of the systems that we're in, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. What was the name of the decolonial theorist? Bell Hooks, was it?
Bell Hooks, yeah.
Bell Hooks, thank you. This image I've put on the board here, this is by William Blake, a poet, a philosopher, a mystic. He saw like angels and visions of God. He must have appeared to many within his time to be quite mad. But here in this depiction, this is taken from his series of mythologies, and it's called The Ancient of Days. And it looks like potentially God, but I think his name's Uravan. I forget. But what he is doing here is he's holding the compasses down from his celestial orb, and the compasses here should be a drawing that he represents logic and reason, but within this process of logical scientific world construction, there are also constraints. And there are these rigid limitations upon him. So for a visionary who believed in like the sublime and the ecstatic vision, as an artist, as a creative, and if you look, I recommend anyone who wants to find definitions, not just of truth and facts, but to look at the definition of those truth and facts within the area of knowledge that you're looking within. And the Encyclopedia Britannica's one is that art is the highest human flourishing, the highest means of communication, the highest form of moral and philosophic and artistic truth. And he actually said that amongst my notes, oh yeah, art is the tree of life. Science is the tree of death. Because look at where we are. Look at where this Western scientific paradigm has gotten us. The age of enlightenment, science and reason, the birth of the Industrial Revolution, exponential growth on a finite resource. And so I think the problems of climate change, which is this huge COP26, of course, a huge topic now, the solutions seem to be, they can only be, like the maths and science has failed when you've got scientists and mathematics pushing an economic model for growth, well, we are destroying ourselves. So you need the artistic expression, you need the narratives to tell the story, to redress the balance. And then all of those narratives and those voices, these indigenous voices that warn of this and offer many more wisdoms, those have been marginalized, but in the process of post-colonialism, we are starting to revalue or listen closer to some of those voices, albeit operating with an overwhelmingly like Western scientific paradigm. Now, we should get on to the last question. I'm going to ask Mr. Hall next to have a look at this one. So history, and this is, if we conclude that there is some knowledge that we should not pursue on ethical grounds, how can we determine the boundaries of acceptable investigation within an area of knowledge? Any thoughts on that as a historian?
I was going to say for that last one, it was really interesting that actually history came up and was mentioned throughout everybody's sort of summary about value and about justification in value was sort of a key aspect, and history was the history of science, the history that we talk about, the history we use came up again and again. This is, I think this is a difficult one because there's obviously the assumption that if we conclude that there is some knowledge that we should not pursue, so we're making the assumption that there is some that we shouldn't pursue, and it's how do we determine the boundaries of that investigation. With history, things that might spring to mind are again the example, the kind of cliched example, but one that comes up a lot is that idea of the Holocaust denialism, is that pursuing how we can refute the existence or the events of the Holocaust. So this one I struggle with actually, because I think the assumption at the beginning of that is quite difficult, and then it's how do we identify limits to historical knowledge.
Well, this idea of Holocaust, we have talked about it before, and in your textbooks, the cognitive textbooks, they talk about the Stanford experiment, Stanford prison experiment, and the Milgram experiment, which are both good, standard, predictable examples. But it's in psychology, the extent to which what knowledge you can learn about human behavior and like whether the Auschwitz guards were culpable, because those experiments show just how much we are manipulated by human behavior and how much we bow down and defer to power and suggestibility. Now, if we divide this class in half and make these prison guards and you guys over there, we make you the prisoners, then bestial depravity and abuse of power occurs within just days. Well, we've scarred the people who are bullies, but we've also like shocked and scarred the people who've done horrible things and find out what they're capable of. So now I think the American Psychological Association, whatever the authorities are, the British Medical Association, and so on, there are regulatory bodies and laws and legislation in place. So human sciences is such a new science, such a, just since Freud, I guess, 1870s, these experiments done in the Wild West of California in the 1960s and 70s, very free thinking. Now there are regulatory bodies. So that's what I might say from a psychological perspective. Miss Lai, what do you think about ethics and science?
I was going to say there is a lot that one can look into when it comes to ethics in sciences. Even just from my brief notes on this question, I've listed things like you could look into guidelines on animal experimentation. That's the classic example of where ethics in sciences come in. I, as a high school student, spent some of my school holidays and summer holidays working at the NIMR in London, the National Institute for Medical Research. And one of the things that we were told on day one to not do, so just like as teachers here at ICHK, we wear these badges all day long, really, at ICHK. And I sometimes forget to take them off, and I go home to my 7-year-old with it on, and he goes, "Why are you wearing this, Mummy?" But when we were at the NIMR, we were told, actually, please remember to take your NIMR badges off before you leave the building. And the reason for that was this, because we would frequently get protesters for animal rights outside of the building, who were becoming, at that time, increasingly violent and threatening towards the staff at the National Institute for Medical Research. But as that name suggests, actually, that particular building focuses on medical research for us, for humans. And it does things like cancer research, it works on things like gene therapy and that kind of thing. And there isn't actually a single, because all these animal rights protesters had these images of chimpanzees, for example, or mammals, really, by and large, and that they would hold up and say, stop animal cruelty and this and that. But what they didn't realize was in this particular building, so I'm not saying that no research is done on mammals, there are, but in that particular building that we worked in, there was not a single mammal in the building. I, in particular, there worked on zebrafish, these tiny little fishes, because of the similarities of their genetics compared to us. And there were certain genes and so on that I was looking into it and what they did in the zebrafish versus how we can apply that in human context. But that's again your classic example there of ethics in science. And then I've got other notes on, say, stem cell research, gene therapy, genetic modifications. Just today in my ESS class, for those of you in the room there, we talked about genetically modified crops and how sometimes foods that are genetically modified have this label of Frankenstein foods attached to them. Okay, again, despite the fact that there is no evidence really scientifically of any adverse health effects that result from them. So lots and lots of things that one can talk about when it comes to ethics and science. And in terms of how we can determine that boundary of acceptable investigation, there are tons of guidelines on things like this. So what can you work on and what you can't work on, and if you do, what kind of boundaries one should set themselves. And all this research is always done in teams, and it's always peer reviewed, and so on and so forth. So I think we do in this natural sciences have a system in place for setting those boundaries. Now, people may agree or disagree, or agree to disagree that these boundaries may not be where they want them to be, but there are certainly guidelines for those in natural sciences. Thank
you. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I was just going to say about going back to the example of history here, identifying boundaries, I suppose, of acceptable investigation, even though we talk about things that may be unpleasant or difficult to hear. I don't think that historians would say that much is out of bounds with regards to investigation. Certainly, some people may suggest that as a white male from a Western tradition investigating, for example, the history of certain group indigenous cultures would be somewhat insensitive. And if you are approaching from a particular viewpoint, then exploring that particular culture may not be, from your perspective, may lead to some lack of awareness, some lack of appreciation of that culture. But those boundaries wouldn't be hard and fast, they'd be flexible. And most historians would argue that they could approach that with some objectivity. Some of it may be controversial, that, for example, a state government, a state authority might say, well, you are actually not going to be able to investigate this part of our history because we don't want you to refute or to argue against what we have putting forward as the origin story of our state. So that would be ethically, you can't talk about it or you can't explore it. But I don't think that historians, the study of history, would do would say that it's difficult to explore that. And I think in most cases there would be an appreciation or an awareness of the field of history for that, taking into consideration those groups that might be affected by the investigation that is being conducted.
Thank you. An example I was thinking about, there was like maybe if you go to like the British Museum, the acquisition of lots of the Elgin marbles, well, they're not Elgins, are they? They're greases, and things like the Benin bronzes. Maybe that the way in which a colonial attitude to understanding history, which is to go in, to conquest the territory and to write the history on behalf of the people there, or to take away and extract from an indigenous history. There's certainly a debate around that at this stage. But I'm wondering, as a mathematician, Kunal, is there pure reasoning? How unethical can that possibly get?
I was about to just make a very little quick comment, and honestly, after doing some digging, mathematics is meant to be pure and also disjointed from essentially ethical grounds. It's meant to be in its most pure form just mathematics. But the question would be, how do we use mathematics in other in other circumstances, such as maybe in the natural sciences? Could we use the mathematics that we have discovered and apply it in an unethical way? Could we take the statistical data that we found out mathematically and use and interpret that in an unethical way? I think that's where we begin to see the deviation from the pureness of mathematics. But and it's on its own, I think I'd hope to see that mathematics stays as pure as possible, because again, it's like I said, it's meant to be disjointed from any ethical misuse.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Khine, any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I think there's actually a surprising amount of concern within the arts and I think literary studies more broadly concerning ethics. I think sometimes we see stories as detached from human experience, but fundamentally stories are human experience, right? They are the one thing that socioculturally across whatever created borders we have, stories are at the heart of all of them, right? And I think that's why the difficult thing about post-colonialism as a critical theory and as a way of approaching kind of textual study or artistic study is that within post-colonial studies, there are other smaller fields, and those fields are essentially all rooted in the experiences of real people. So if we think about migration studies, trauma studies, these are all rooted in the lived experiences of people. And my question at least would be, well, how far can we go into those studies without asking these individuals themselves who've experienced migration, forced migration, and also trauma as a result of these contexts and situations? How far can we go into these studies without deferring to them, really? Because sometimes that reference isn't enough, right? we have to actually go to the source of understanding, to the source of experience, to the source of what I would argue is truth, and have that discussion, right? Because I think the difficult thing about, you know, gaining knowledge from another culture is that, well, that culture isn't necessarily there for analysis, right? That culture isn't necessarily there for our discussion and interpretation. That's just our way of viewing it, and how we think it's, you know, how we think it's necessary to value knowledge, right? And that's what universities do as well, right? It's about the picking apart, the studying. It's what we ask you to do in English as well, right? When that isn't necessarily what should, quote unquote, be done. And there's a really great kind of visual example of that, in case any of you are interested. There's a documentary from 2016 called Fire at Sea, and it's by Gianfranco Rossi, I think. And it's set on the island of Lampedusa, I think, in Italy, where that kind of became a central talking point of the migrant crisis in 2015, 2016. And I think that, I can't go into it into much detail now, but I think that's really a great representation of how we can explore, you know, the post-colonial in action in, I think, an ethical way.
Great. I got the name of the director, Gianfranco Rossi. What was the title?
Fire at Sea.
Fire at Sea.
Yeah, at sea, as in like the ocean, the sea.
Can you spell it?
SEA.
Fire Sea, right.
Fire at
Fire at Sea. Okay, good. Now, Mr. Narwani made a point which I want to try and like wrap this up now. Mathematics, it exists in the abstract, it's pure reasoning, except so often it isn't, right? It becomes the central code of how we make economic decisions based upon supply and demand and based upon the rate of return. And that is right, the driving force for like the machinery of the thing that propels this Western scientific industrialized process. And then if we think on the extreme of things, again, the Nazis, right? It's an extreme example, but if you really go to the farther fringes of looking at like pure logic and statistics, if you reduce the human stories down to statistics and numbers and you dehumanize, it becomes much easier to make decisions which are rational and can be justified. Now, maybe from a Nazi perspective, it's about purity of blood. It's about economic benefit by eradicating someone who's allegedly taken away from your home Aryan group. And there's a real danger of that in totalitarian regimes, but also in the economic systems that we have. I just have got on the screen in relation to to tie it back to our first question, there's a world of difference between truth and facts. In artistic expression, we might have realism, we might have a still life of a bowl of fruit or whatever else. Now that's good at providing a reflection of the world as accurately as possible, but the human experience is more than that. So often our human stories are fragmented, our memories are disjointed, our human societies are complex and interrelated. And I think that two texts here, which Slaughterhouse-Five begins, Billy Pilgrim says, all this happened, more or less. And then this story about going to war is, it takes him, he's abducted by aliens. And here in Picasso's Guernica, we don't have a realist depiction of the bombing of Guernica by the Nazis. We've got this abstract, expressionist, fractured, shattered depiction of maybe the psychological reality of the horror of that experience. So I think thank you very much to Mr. Narwani, Mr. Hall, Ms. Khine, Ms. Lai. What we've been able to do is explore three questions with quite a lot of different examples, and I think we could carry on, but we will wrap that up there. It's been quite a long session. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And maybe we could just wave goodbye to the class. We're here behind me. Bye, everyone. Bye from ICHK. Bye, bye. Okay, see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.